From the heart of Africa, Burkina Faso shines anew.
The Africa spoke. Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful African stories.
She wasn't a president, she wasn't a judge, she wasn't even a politician, but she stood before the world's most powerful mining giants and made them answer. While much of the world's attention was locked on political drama and global conflicts, something extraordinary was quietly unfolding in a dusty courtroom in West Africa. No headlines, no breaking news, no CNN special, just a woman in a dark hijab, holding a thick red folder, and a nation holding its breath. Her name wasn't on any ballot. She didn't give speeches. She wasn't the kind of figure foreign investors feared. And yet, in that moment, every eye in the courtroom was on her. She stood alone, facing men in $1,000 suits. CEOs, lawyers, ministers, men who for decades had signed away the wealth of her country with the stroke of a pen. But she had done something they never expected. She read the fine print. What she found buried in invisible ink and legal footnotes led to one of the most shocking courtroom showdowns in Africa's modern history, a lawsuit that forced global mining corporations to return over $10 billion to the people of Burkina Faso. She did it without firing a shot, without shouting, without fanfare, just evidence, just truth. And the world? It watched in stunned silence as history was rewritten, not by a general or a president, but by a woman who refused to look away. So here's the question we begin with today. Can one woman, armed with nothing but a pencil and the truth, rewrite the rules for an entire nation? And if she can, why haven't more of us tried? The story didn't begin in a courtroom. It began in a back room, far from the cameras, far from the headlines. Late one night, in a quiet corner of the presidential residence in Ouagadougou, a woman sat alone at an old wooden desk. Her name wasn't known to the world, but in her hands was something that would soon shake it. She wasn't looking for fame, she wasn't looking for scandal, she was looking for something that didn't sit right. The numbers coming from Burkina Faso's gold mining operations seemed too perfect, neat, clean, as if someone had polished the truth a little too much, and to a trained eye like hers, once a forensic financial analyst for a global anti-corruption NGO, that kind of perfection was a red flag. So, she started digging. At first, it was just a gut feeling, but then she found it. A contract from 2011, buried in a file labeled Logistics 3B. The print was small, size 8 font, and there in legalese a clause read, royalty calculation based on declared net output, adjusted quarterly at operator's discretion. It sounded harmless, standard language perhaps, but something felt off. So she pulled the actual export manifests. What she found made her stop cold. Quarter by quarter, the numbers declared by the mining companies were always slightly, just slightly, lower than what had actually been exported. Not enough to raise alarms, just enough to slip under the radar. But when you're talking about gold, even a few missing ounces mean millions of dollars. And these weren't just a few ounces. One row on her spreadsheet hit hard, Q2, 2014. Declared output, 38,920 OZs. Actual exports, 42,750 OZs. A difference of nearly $7 million in gold from a single site in a single quarter. And it happened again and again, across multiple sites, spanning a decade. The pattern was undeniable. They weren't falsifying numbers. That would be easy to catch. Instead, they were selectively under-declaring, shaving off just enough to keep suspicion low while routing the excess profits through a web of offshore companies in Malta, Switzerland, and the British Virgin Islands. She whispered to herself, staring at the screen. They didn't hide the money, they hid the method. For 5 weeks, she worked in silence. No assistants, no aides, just her, a stack of printouts, color-coded spreadsheets, and a steaming cup of mint tea that would go cold before she remembered to drink it. She built the case slowly, like a prosecutor preparing for a trial no one had scheduled yet. 4 binders, red, blue, green, and black, each filled with footnotes, diagrams, and translated summaries in plain French. Not legalese, not theory, just facts. Then one night, she called her husband into the room. He entered in uniform, expecting a policy update. But when she slid the red binder across the desk, he sat down slowly, reading in silence. A few pages in, he asked, "Are these the official export numbers?" She nodded. "And the discrepancies?" 10 years' worth, she said. "Hidden in contracts, buried in footnotes, but it's all here." He said nothing. He didn't need to. That night, neither of them slept. By sunrise, he had called the Minister of Justice. By sunset, subpoenas were issued. Within 48 hours, the first executives from a European mining consortium received letters that would change everything. It wasn't just a corruption case. It wasn't just about gold. This was a betrayal of trust, of sovereignty, of time. And it all started with a woman, a pencil, and a single contract. The room fell silent when she walked in. No guards, no entourage, just her and the red folder. Across the table sat men in tailored suits, polished cufflinks catching the light from the chandelier above. Executives from 3 of the largest mining corporations in Europe. Their posture, relaxed, smug. They didn't see what was coming. But that folder, it would change everything. She opened it with calm hands. Inside were spreadsheets, audit trails, export discrepancies, maps layered with satellite data, and a web of offshore transfers so intricate that even the most seasoned financial analysts would need a second look. And then she spoke, not loudly, not dramatically, but with quiet force. "You've been reporting revenues based on declared yield, not actual extraction volume. Your profits, your real profits, are hidden through 5 shell companies: Malta, Switzerland, British Virgin Islands. We've traced every wire transfer." The smirk on the CEO's face twitched. She flipped to page 16. "This one alone," she said, tapping with her finger, 48 million, undeclared, untaxed. Hidden in a numbered account belonging to the cousin of your board director." Around the room, government ministers leaned in. Some clenched their fists, others blinked in disbelief. And then the question came, whispered, almost trembling. Who are you?" She finally looked up. "I'm the wife of the man you tried to outmaneuver, and I'm the reason this room still has a ceiling." At that exact moment, the doors opened. President Ibrahim Traoré entered. No military fanfare, no stage performance. He simply walked to her side, placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, and said, "My wife is not here to accuse you. She's here to offer you one chance to tell the truth, before the law asks you under oath." The room didn't breathe, but the moment was far from over. Because they had made one fatal miscalculation. They thought it was just an internal matter. A meeting behind closed doors. But behind the mirrored glass, the press had been watching the entire time. And now the story was out. By morning, headlines across West Africa blared, "Burkina Faso First Lady exposes 10-year mining fraud worth billions. Gold stolen in silence, returned through truth." In European boardrooms, damage control began. Phone lines burned. Lawyers assembled. And then came the envoy. He arrived from Europe wearing a perfect suit and an arrogant scowl. No appointment, no diplomacy, just anger. He slammed the door open and pointed across the room. "This is an outrage. You've humiliated our investors, froze their assets, and based on what? Accusations from your own household?" Still silence. "Pull back this madness," he hissed. "Do you think you can afford the fallout? The aid? The trade privileges?" Traoré stood. "You were not invited," he said, voice calm. But the truth was. And then she stepped forward. Without raising her voice, she slid a document across the table. "This transfer," she said, "from Argus Mining to Kestrel Consulting, your capital city, 32 minutes after a tax exemption was approved here by someone in your own trade ministry." The envoy paled. "This isn't personal," Traoré added. "It's national, and we will not be bullied out of our sovereignty." The envoy turned to leave, but was handed a small USB by an aide. 400 pages, the aide said. "The press gets the rest tomorrow." That was the moment everything changed. The trial wouldn't be held in The Hague, not in Paris, but in Ouagadougou, on African soil. under African sunlight. No powdered wigs, no colonial decor, just 3 judges in robes woven from faso dan fani, the traditional cotton cloth once banned under colonial rule. And at the center of it all, a woman in modest black. No microphone, no title, just truth. They didn't just win the case, they redrew the lines of power. When the judges delivered their verdict, ordering the mining corporations to repay $10 billion in stolen royalties, there was no confetti, no fireworks, no military parade, but something else happened. Across the capital of Ouagadougou, the streets didn't erupt in cheers, they quieted, as if the nation was listening to itself breathe for the first time in decades. Vendors paused their sales. Bus drivers pulled over. Children stopped playing. People weren't celebrating money. They were mourning the time that had been stolen. From the hills of Taparco to the border villages of Essakane, elders whispered, "Now we know where our roads went. Now we know why the clinics never opened." In small towns, mothers held up old utility bills and muttered, "They told us the country was broke, and they were lying." But perhaps the most powerful reaction came not from the courtroom or the politicians, but from the schools. Across Burkina Faso, classrooms replayed the trial footage. Teachers turned down the lights. They pointed to the screen as the First Lady stood in front of a whiteboard with 2 columns, declared and extracted. She didn't lecture, she didn't dramatize, she just wrote numbers, quietly, truthfully. And in that stillness, something awakened. In a dusty classroom in Bobo Dioulasso, a young girl raised her hand and asked, "Can we learn how to read contracts too?" The teacher smiled. That smile would spread further than any breaking news ever could. Within weeks, local radio stations across the country began broadcasting contract clauses in plain language. No legalese, no political spin. One station aired a special segment every evening called "Read What They Don't Want You to Read." Meanwhile, in the National Assembly, a single sheet of paper changed the nation again. A bill titled Law for Transparent Stewardship of Natural Wealth. It passed with 0 opposition, unanimous. For the first time in Burkina Faso's legislative history, every hand in the chamber went up, not a single vote against. The law established a public audit council composed of citizens, not just politicians. Half men, half women. 2 seats reserved for youth under 30. Every mining contract would now be read aloud on national radio before it could be signed. No more secrecy. No more invisible ink. The impact rippled across the region. In Ghana, citizen audit boards began to form. In Tanzania, old contracts were reopened. Even in countries still entangled in foreign debt, people began to whisper the same words. Where is the revenue from Lot 42? That one question, asked not with anger but with clarity, became a rallying cry. It was painted on school walls, printed on t-shirts, etched into protest signs. Not because people expected a perfect government, but because they now expected accountability. The First Lady, though, refused every award. She declined a cabinet position. She didn't campaign, didn't tour, didn't even give interviews. She simply said, "If the law lives only on paper, it will die in silence. But if it lives in your eyes, it will never go missing again." Behind the scenes, she launched a nationwide curriculum on financial transparency, now taught in every secondary school. Girls began trading notebooks filled not with song lyrics, but with footnotes and ledger formulas. Some even started drawing murals of her in their math books, always with a pen in hand, pointing to a line that had once been skipped. And in the villages, a new kind of hero was emerging. Not soldiers, not presidents, but auditors, analysts, truth-tellers. The people had seen what silence costs, and they had decided, never again. The world wasn't ready for what happened in Burkina Faso. In Washington, State Department briefings used words like unexpected precedent and regional volatility. In Brussels, think tanks scrambled to assess what this meant for investment confidence across West Africa. Behind closed doors, European trade envoys asked the same question. If they can win this, who's next? But it wasn't just about Burkina Faso. It was about what happens when a nation no longer asks permission to read its own contracts. The trial in Ouagadougou sent shockwaves. Not because it was loud, but because it was firm. Because for once, a developing country didn't wait for The Hague or the IMF or any Western approval to seek justice. They held court on their own soil, under their own law, in their own language. And America? Well, the response was complicated. Many U.S. citizens, especially older generations, watched the footage with admiration. Some remembered Watergate, Enron, and other moments when truth cracked through the walls of power. Letters poured into the editorial pages of major American newspapers. "I never thought I'd see it in Africa first," one reader wrote. She did what our own Congress sometimes fails to do, but in corporate circles the tone was different. Legal firms began revising their compliance manuals. Mining lobbyists called for clarity in African business environments. Some suggested that countries like Burkina Faso were becoming too independent. Too independent, as if demanding the truth from billion-dollar corporations was a threat to global order. Yet, perhaps that's exactly the point. Because the woman in the hijab didn't just expose a theft, she exposed a pattern, a system that depended on silence, complexity, and assumed obedience. And by simply reading what wasn't meant to be read, she reminded the world that justice doesn't belong to the powerful. It belongs to those willing to look closer. So the question for the world is no longer, will Africa catch up? But rather, will the world accept a continent that finally knows how to count? She didn't ask for applause. She never raised her voice. She didn't hold a microphone or sit in an official cabinet seat. And yet, one quiet woman changed the future of a nation, not by rewriting the laws, but by finally reading them. Her greatest act wasn't the exposure of theft, it was the restoration of dignity. And in doing so, she left us with a simple, haunting question. What have we ignored because it was printed too small? In Burkina Faso, the people now call her La Ministra de l'Homme, the Shadow Minister. Not because she hid in the shadows, but because she stood behind every truth that power tried to hide. But this story isn't just about Africa, it's about all of us. Wherever you live, whether it's a small mining town in West Virginia, a farming village in the Sahel, or a suburb outside Chicago, there are contracts being signed in your name. Do you know what they say? Do your children? Do your leaders? Because the next stolen future may not be measured in gold or oil, but in clean water never delivered, in bridges never built, in communities told they were too poor to ask. So we end with a question, not to her, but to you. Do you think that President Ibrahim Traoré's fight for national reform is just the beginning or the exception? Can the truth still change something in our world, or have we grown too used to silence? If you believe the law belongs to the people, not just those who write it, please share this story. If you believe that Africa deserves to stand on its own terms, like this video and subscribe. And finally, if you've ever asked, where did the money go? Don't stop asking, because sometimes all it takes is one person who refuses to skip the footnotes.